All right, today we are going to be talking about number properties. Now I have the number properties chart up here if you want to take a minute and write this table down. I'm going to go through each property individually, but I recommend having this table written down so that hopefully it makes a little more sense as I'm walking through each property. And then maybe you can make notes next to each one. We have 4 different properties, and if you notice, the top 3 have an addition and multiplication aspect to them. Distributive property is the only property that has one rule, okay? Whereas commutative, associative, and identity properties have an addition aspect and a multiplication aspect. Please pause the video and write down this table. I will show it again towards the end of it, but it's a good idea to have this written down beforehand. And it's a good cheat sheet. Great, the first property we're going to go through is the commutative property. Right? And the word commutative comes from the word commute. So if you think about your parents commute to work, right? You guys commute to work or to school. Okay, you go to school and you come home to school, okay, or moving around. Okay, so commutative property is one that refers to things moving around. So for example, the addition property of commutative, we have A plus B is the same thing as B plus A, okay, which you guys are like, duh, right? We've known that forever, but now we have a term for it. We call that the commutative property of addition. When we know that 2 numbers, if we flip them around and add them, it's the same thing. Okay, so for example, using numbers, let's say we have 1 plus 3. That's the exact same thing as saying 3 plus 1. We get 4 both ways. We call that the commutative property of addition. Obviously, it works the same for multiplication. It doesn't matter which order you multiply things in, you'll get the same answer. So let's do 5 times 4 is the same thing as 4 times 5, right? We get 20 for both of them. Right? And you guys are like, duh, I've known that my whole life. Okay, but now we just have a name to them. So that's the most important part of these properties is just, yes, you probably understand the concept of it, but just having a name to refer it to. Okay, so anytime we like flip or move around numbers or letters, okay, that's the commutative property. And we can only use this with addition and multiplication. Okay, so if you want to write that part down too, addition and multiplication only. Okay, obviously it doesn't work for subtraction for obvious reasons. If I do 1 minus 3, that's not the same thing as 3 minus 1. And same would go for division. I wouldn't get the same thing if I did 5 divided by 4 and 4 divided by 5. So that's why we only have addition and multiplication for the commutative property. Next, the associative property. This one tends to be easily confused with the distributive property, so when I get there, I'll explain why. But the associative property states that you can add or multiply regardless of how the numbers are grouped together. Okay, so by grouped, they're talking about parentheses, right? Really, you can add parentheses anywhere you'd like when we are just adding numbers together or multiplying numbers together, and we get the same result. Okay, so notice here in the first example, they grouped A and B together, and in the other part, they grouped B and C together. Right? And it doesn't matter which way they group them, they're going to get the same answer. Okay, so let's say we have 1 plus 2 plus 3. Then I have 1 plus 2 plus 3 over here. Now, obviously, we know parentheses, usually we go first. So if I add 1 and 2 together, I get 3. And when I add this 3 last, I get 6 on this side. And over here, if I add 2 plus 3 together, I get 5. And then when I add 1, I end up getting 6 for my final answer on this side. So they're just saying I can add 1, 2, and 3 together in any grouping or any way, and I'm going to get the same result. Okay, so typically you're going to see the parentheses move. Okay, so you're going to see the parentheses move location. Okay, the word associate is also in here, so the parentheses are going to associate with different numbers. Okay, same would go for multiplication. If I multiply 1 times 2 first and then times 3, it'd be the same thing as multiplying 2 and 3 together and then times 1. I'm still going to get 6 as my final result. So this only works for addition and multiplication. Okay, and you'll see the parentheses move spots. So you'll see parentheses on both sides of the equal sign when we're talking about associative. Next, we have the identity property. Again, we have the identity property of addition and the identity property of multiplication. Okay, so the identity property for addition tells us that if we add 0 to anything, the number stays the same, right? If I add 0 to any number in the world, I'm still going to get that same number. I'm going to get itself. It's keeping its identity. Also, we have the identity property of multiplication. If I multiply any number by 1, I'm going to get that same number. Right? They're the easiest operations in the universe, I think. Okay? But now we have a name for it. Okay, so anytime you see multiplying by 1 or adding 0, that is the identity property. Because if you notice in our example here, 4 times 1, 4 stays itself. It keeps its identity. 6 times 1, same thing. We keep it as -6. 13 plus 0, same number. -7 plus 0, same. Okay, so it keeps its same identity. It doesn't change based on the number operation. Last but not least is the distributive property. To distribute means to share or part with something. Okay, so distribute, like I distribute papers, right? I'm not just going to distribute papers to one person in the class. I'm going to distribute my papers to all the students in the class. So for example, this is saying that 4 times x, and then doing 4 times 3. That 4 times x, that's where I get my 4x over here. And then 4 times 3, that's how I get my 12, because 4 times 3 is 12. So I distributed this 4 to the x on the inside and to the 3 on the inside. So I distributed that number out in front. And notice that the parentheses then went away. Okay, so I said that this one is easily confused with the associative property because there are parentheses in both. But in the associative property, remember we had parentheses move. So I would have seen parentheses over here if we were dealing with the associative property. The distributive property gets rid of the parentheses. I distributed that 4 to the x and then to the 3. And it's the same thing as 4x plus 12. Okay, if you want to see this with some numbers, we'll use our 1, 2, 3. Okay, so I would distribute the 1 to the 2, because 1 times 2 is 2. 1 times 3 is 3. So I get 2 plus 3 over on my left. Now that is, if I add 2 and 3 together, I get 5. And if I do 2 plus 3 times 1, I get 5 over here. So just like with our x values, we can have that equal sign there. They mean the same thing. Okay, that was just one example. Don't pay attention to it if that example didn't make sense to you. Okay, so here's the table you saw at the beginning. We have the commutative property. Remember, when the numbers or the letters flip back and forth, okay, or move around, they commute. A plus B is the same thing as B plus A. The associative property is when the parentheses associate with different numbers or the parentheses move location. So notice in the addition one, we have the parentheses with A and B, and then the parentheses with B and C in the other part. The identity property is anytime we add 0 to something, it stays itself. Anytime we multiply by 1, it stays itself. Then the distributive property is probably the most challenging for people. Right? We distribute that A to the B to get AB. We distribute the A to the C to get AC. We're going to go through just a few examples on how you're going to see this in your homework. So I have 9 examples up here, and our job is to identify what property is being used. Now, some of these might be none, and that's okay. I want you to be specific on whether we're using the addition or multiplication part of the property. And I'm going to abbreviate as we go. If you want to take a minute and try these 9 and then check my work as I go or pause it before I move on to the next one, it's up to you. Okay, I'm going to start with number 1 here, and I see 11 plus 0 is still equal to 11. Okay, so that's telling me that I added 0 and I kept the same identity. So this would be the identity property of addition. And I'm just abbreviating just to make it easier, otherwise it would take me a while to write out the identity property of addition. Next, I have x times y times z, then I have x times y times z. Notice my parentheses are around the y and the z, and then they're around the x and the y. So since the parentheses moved location, that would be the associative property of multiplication, because I'm multiplying there. Number 3, I have 8 plus negative 8, that equals 0. I don't remember any properties where I'm adding and then adding the negative and to get a result of 0. I don't have any properties that I can think of, so this one would be none. 14 plus 20 equals 20 plus 14. So I noticed that I flipped 14 and 20 around. They moved location, or they commuted. So that would be the commutative property, and then of addition, since we are adding. Number 5, I have 2 times 1/2 equals 1. Okay, well, that can't be the identity property because I'm not multiplying by 1 or adding 0. I don't have the commutative property because I need to have them flipped around on the other side of the equal sign. There are no parentheses, so that can't be associative or distributive, so I'm going to have to say none for this one. For number 6, I'm noticing that I'm multiplying by 1 and it stays the same, so that would be the identity property of multiplication because I'm multiplying by 1. Number 7, I have 19 plus 12 plus 8, and then 19 plus 12 plus 8. I notice again the parentheses are in different spots, so that would have to be the associative property, and since I am adding, it would be the associative property of addition. Number 8, I have a times 9 and then 9 times a. I notice the 9 and the a flipped spots, so they would be the commutative property, and that would be multiplication since we are multiplying. Last one, I have 7 times 4 plus 11 equals 7 times 4 plus 7 times 11. I notice that that 7 is in there twice in the second part, so I'm guessing that 7 was distributed to both numbers, to the 4 and to the 11. So that would be the distributive property.